So my name is Bridget Griffin and I am a lead reviewer for Child Safeguarding Practice Reviews, and before that time series case reviews. So I've been leading reviews across the country for the last 10 years, specialising in infants who've died as a result of neglect, and also looking at services provided to adolescents who have either taken their own lives or taken the lives of others. And as you will appreciate, in their past is a history of neglect. So the focus today is looking at a case review that was completed in Norfolk. It's a child safeguarding practice review involving 5 children. And I'm going to extend that to an attempt to look more broadly and have a look at the ripples of neglect over time. So how neglect affects children across their lifespan, and touching on some child safeguarding practice reviews that I've been part of across the country, looking at the impact of neglect in adolescence. So I just want to start with the principles that should be applied to all child safeguarding practice reviews. So just taking them from the work of Sidney Dekker, who worked and specialised in looking at safety, particularly within engineering and the health economy. What Dekker says is that underneath every simple, obvious story about human error, there's a deeper, more complex story about the organisation. The second story, in other words, is a story of real complexity, and that's the world you work in, not a story about apparent simplicity. Systems are basically not safe. People have to create safety despite a system that places sometimes other contradictory demands upon them. So that's taken from the Field Guide to Understanding Human Error by Sidney Dekker, and that should be the basis of all child safeguarding practice reviews. It's simply not about human error. It's not about what a practitioner did or didn't do in relation to a family. It's about all those contributory factors that exist within agencies, organisations, and across our multi-agency landscape, those contributory factors that help or hinder us in that very complex work that we do. And just taking the words from Bevington, who works at the Anna Freud Centre, who works with young people at high risk across the multi-agency, multidisciplinary landscape. He said, rocket science are claimed to do the most complex work. It's simply not true. Multi-agency, multidisciplinary work with complex children is simply much more complicated. So they're the sort of key principles of a child safeguarding practice review. So just focusing on the Norfolk child safeguarding practice review. So this was called AK, it's published on the Norfolk Safeguarding Partnership website. Family of 5 siblings, whose ages ranged between a baby of 4 weeks to teenagers 15 years. So 5 siblings in all. They were known and known well, and that sort of idea of a family being known and known well across multi-agency services. There's a story, there's a narrative that's held within multi-agency records about the family. Across the lifespan, so across 15 years of the children's lives, so the eldest, as I said, was 15. So sadly, the child safeguarding practice review was triggered at the very sad death of the baby who was 4 weeks old at the time. And all the children remained at home during the entire period of the child safeguarding practice review. So that incident, that tragic incident, didn't trigger a particularly different response. But you'll see, and I'll come to this a bit later, what actually happened during the course of the child safeguarding practice review that changed the outcome of the children. So just starting with a very tragic incident, mother had attended a family party, all the other children were up there. This is a family, there's 5 different fathers, so they're all staying with their different family members. She attended the party, she'd taken her baby with her. She freely said she drank alcohol, she smoked cannabis, and that was confirmed by family members. Before she went to bed, placed Joe, the 4-week-old baby, in bed with her, co-slept. In the morning, Joe was found very sadly by mum. She was unresponsive, and when the ambulance crew arrived, she was pronounced dead at the scene. And there were concerns that this was a matter of overlay. The coroner's report confirmed that while they couldn't rule out overlay, they could not conclude conclusively that her death was a result of overlay. So I've touched on the history, really, really long history. I mean, we're talking hundreds of practitioners involved over 15 years, clinicians, health visitors, GPs, midwives, school teachers for the deaf, audiology, ophthalmology, speech and language therapists, and for the two younger siblings, education, health and care plans. So information was held on records in relation to sporadic episodes of domestic abuse and physical chastisement, and those issues were responded to at the time. They all attended the same primary school, all these children, so they actually met with teachers who worked at those primary schools, who'd actually known these children all of their lives. They provided extensive interventions and support to mother in co-parenting, in effect, her children. The children were previously in response to these sporadic, acute episodes of concern. These episodes of concern were responded to. There was an acute response from across the multi-agency group to respond to concerns around physical harm, which was defined as physical chastisement, we'll come back to that, to domestic abuse and to mothers' drug and alcohol misuse. The children were the subject of a child in need plan just prior to Joe's birth and for a very short time afterwards. As I said, there was extensive support across a range, and in total, hundreds of practitioners, clinicians, teachers involved with the family. So that was the history when I came in to lead this child safeguarding practice review after the sad death of Joe. So at the very start of, for those of you who've been involved in child safeguarding practice reviews, you'll be aware that the Safeguarding Partnership set some key lines of inquiry right at the very beginning, and that can be informed by what they've seen about the case, what they've read in the multi-agency records, what are the priorities is another consideration, and what does local intelligence tell them about their local system that they want to know more about. So starting with the first question, to what extent did the multi-agency network understand, assess and respond to neglect, including the risks to the newborn baby, and what impact did it have on the children's lived experience? So what the review found was that there was just a complete absence of a joined up approach to understanding and responding to neglect. There was little agreement about how to respond to episodes of concern or to the chronic concerns that were held, particularly, as again, by schools. And these concerns were escalated, discussed in supervision, shared within the individual agency, but despite escalation, nothing really changed. Things remained more of the same. And these disagreements lasted throughout the child safeguarding practice review. They were going on at the time of the actual review. Meeting with practitioners from across the workforce, particularly schools, spoke to me about how unhappy they were about the fact that the children remained at home and for how long they'd been concerned. I mean, we're talking about teachers having sleepless nights. They were so concerned about these children. They understood their lived worlds. And these disagreements were resolved, but it was at the very latter stages of this child safeguarding practice review. As identified by Beckett, some of the reasons for that is neglect is just simply complex. It's not that it's impossible to define. It can't be defined in absolute terms. So like other forms of maltreatment, it needs to be interpreted in context. So it's clear from the child safeguarding practice reviews that I've completed, but also from national reviews, from Ofsted inspections, and from joint area targeted inspections, that responding to neglect remains a national challenge. And areas are at different stages of their journey in relation to how we support practitioners in understanding and responding to neglect. So tools have been adopted from across across the country. They're all at really different stages of development. Some are well embedded, some are partially embedded, some are just starting to be embedded. And training has been provided. We spoke to practitioners, clinicians, teachers who'd attended graded care profile training, for example, in Norfolk, but it lost its traction over time. And strategies are written as you have your strategy in Walsall. So the graded care profile was the evidence-based tool, and there are others, but this is the main tool in use across the country. It's either graded care profile 1 or 2. It was adopted in Norfolk in 2016, so that's sometime, a number of years since this child safeguarding practice review started. But there was no shared approach, despite adoption of that tool. And the result was drift, indecision, and fragmented multi-agency working. And I can't tell you how many times practitioners spoke to me about, we started again and again and again. They started again when a new episode arose, started again when there was a change of social worker. It was just that sense of just going, this revolving cycle that was starting again. And that critical issue was the lack of an agreed approach and the lack of an evidence-based tool that everybody was signed up to. But that was contributed to by organisational changes, organisational flux, frequent changes of social workers, and a lack of understanding of roles and responsibilities, who needed to do what in relation to this family. So part of this, so one of the things that you probably know within child safeguarding practice reviews is that we hold reflective learning events with practitioners. And what we ask practitioners to do is to reflect, those practitioners who have direct involvement with families, reflect on the work that was undertaken and consider what could have been different, really. I mean, I was very clearly felt it was really disingenuous to engage practitioners in that reflective event when there remained disagreement about the support and the services being provided to these children. These children remained at home. That was the issue that needed to be resolved within the partnership. So I met with senior managers in order to present some of the findings of the review and to really speak to the children's lived experiences. My intention for that was absolutely to draw them in to the child safeguarding review process, and also for them to own some of the findings. But a third area was to really pay attention to what was going on in this family right here, right now, and those children's lived experiences. And that did make a difference, and I'll come on to that. This was the view of these senior managers who were part of the Protecting Babies subgroup in Norfolk, echoed by practitioners, is that using an evidence-based assessment tool, such as the graded care profile, allows a consistent view of the family to be maintained, which can mitigate the risks of staff turnover. It allows, and Isabel, you touched on this, it absolutely allows transparency with families. And I'll go on to talk about mother's perspective, but it was very unclear to her, with the hundreds of professionals, multiple tasks that were set, what she needed to do, by when, and what would be the consequences of not doing that for her individual children. So it allowed for that honest relationship with families. Absolutely has to evidence issues, progress, and measure progress. It helps to show cumulative harm. It sort of brings it to the fore. It's not like one of those weird magic eye pictures. It kind of brings it to the fore, and you can actually see much more clearly what is going on in the family and what is the lived experience of each individual child. So it makes it less nebulous, less vague, and neglect can feel something really difficult to grasp in terms of understanding what's going on with children. Informs plans and interventions, and it maintains a composite organisational memory, so the memory doesn't go with the change of social worker, the change of clinician, the change of school or teachers. It remains a composite organisational memory, without which the view of harm is just compromised by constantly being in the here and now. What's happening today? How do we respond today to that specific incident of harm being caused to this child? And this is just a quote from one of the practitioners. Neglect as a word can create a sort of almost like a white noise in the system, a noise in the system that doesn't describe the child's experience of harm without the graded care profile. There's an overemphasis on parental voice. So in this case, the maternal narrative absolutely dominated the way in which services responded. So just part of the findings, critical part of the finding in this section, was understanding and appreciating the uniqueness of children. What is their unique experience of harm, particularly neglect? Their ages, their stages, their gender, their position in the family, any particular additional needs. What does each individual child need? So in order to do that, I really tried to get to the lived experience of the children. That wasn't apparent in the agency records, but it became apparent from speaking to the teachers who knew these children best. By the way, it's all been anonymised, gender's been changed, etc., etc. So here we have the eldest child in the family, it's Tom. So Tom, 15, school staff spoke about him often being tearful, so he's into teenagers, moving into late teenage years. Seek support, there were a lot of trusted adults, really good practice that were provided to Tom at school, although just not happy to share what's going on for him. He felt he'd shared it time and time again, in fact, and nothing really changed in terms of his daily life. He's written down often feels sick and described as wanting to kill himself at the thought of coming to school. So in the history, deliberate self-harm and concerns about sexual vulnerability, risk of exploitation, and all these concerns were coming up and growing at the time of which Tom is 15, going on to 16. He's described as a child who lacks confidence in his ability and is finding it really difficult to achieve in a whole range of different domains in his life. So next we have Stacey. Stacey's 13. Very recently, at the time of the review, whilst there were a rumbling of concerns about Stacey over primary school and early attendance at secondary school, as she's coming in and reaching adolescence, she started to wander out of class, punching the walls and doors, and she was suspended from school at the time at which I concluded this child they've gone in practice review. I managed to speak, was grateful to speak to her dad, who was really willing to be part of this review and is actually pretty active in Stacey's life when she was younger. And himself and his long-term partner described her as a young child who was quite unhappy, who found it really difficult to play or to connect or engage with the family when she stayed there, and she preferred to just isolate in her room alone. Really sadly, Stacey has openly spoken about feeling responsible for her sister's death. She said she's argued and argued with Mum, trying to persuade her to leave Joe at home with her, that she would look after Joe. She was worried about Mum. She was worried about Joe. She feels she should have made sure this happens, and she continues to date to feel responsible for the death of her sister. So moving on to Jake. Jake's still at primary school, moving into secondary school very soon. Jake's profoundly deaf as a result of meningitis when he was a very young child. So these are Jake's words. If I take off my cochlear implants, so he wears cochlear implants at all times, I can't hear anything, but I can feel noise vibrations. I'm shy and I'm always late for school. So his cochlear implants regularly over his childhood, missing damage to his speech and language, were very delayed. Peers couldn't understand him, and nobody at home was able to communicate with Jake. Despite persistent attempts by school to teach Mum and Dad British Sign Language, just didn't attend, and so therefore nobody could communicate. Talks about being hurt, this relates to shouting, says he understands the shouting by the body language that's being shown. Very fearful child. Tooth decay, head lice, persistent head lice. Again, school trying really, really hard to get rid of this head lice, bringing mum in, teaching her, but it's persistently there. And teachers spoke about them just dropping out of his head as he sat in the class, describing these as spiders in my head. He spends most of the time, or spent most of the time, in his room, playing on the internet, with concerns about him starting to connect with adults who posed a risk. Described as seeing dark shapes in his room, can't understand it, can't talk to anyone about it. Nobody can understand him at home. He'd go to school and talk about it. And then he spoke about seeing a demon on the roof of the school. Recently, during the Child Safeguarding Practice Review, I heard that he'd started to hide in cupboards rather than attend lessons. He likes quiet places. He needs people to communicate him visually. He says loud noises hurt my ears. So, at the time that this information was coming through, these children were still at home. Then we have Faye. Faye 8, known really well at primary school. All the children, as I said, attended the same primary school. Consists of concerns about cognitive development, speech and language really delayed, really struggled to communicate with peers, with teachers, functioning 2 years below chronological age, so functioning around a 6-year-old and having obvious implications in terms of relationship with peers. Had a really close relationship with paternal grandmother, who I had the pleasure of meeting on a couple of occasions, and his birth father. And the care provided by paternal grandmother was good. And Faith spoke about, I want my mum to get better. And in terms of what that meant, is I want my mum to just stop shouting. And that was a daily event for all of them. I'll go on to the outcomes, actually, what happened afterwards, a bit later on. And finally, we have Joe. Joe, born into that 5-member family. As I say, all the children had different fathers. So this was born to the 5th birth father connected to the family. She was not a planned pregnancy, delayed contact with antenatal services, records of dehydration and vomiting, and fathers actually said during the review, you need to check that. That's a result of our alcohol use. So, you know, clearly these were people who had concerns and had information that could have been shared at the time. As I say, mother co-slept with Joe, sadly resulting in his death. So this term, this is a case of low-level neglect. And I heard that time and time again. I think nearly every clinician and practitioner I spoke to, because I spoke to 30 one-to-one, said, well, this is a case of low-level neglect. Well, what does low-level neglect mean for children? And this is just the work of Broomfield. So what we need to think is cumulative. What is the cumulative impact? Not what is the impact of an individual incident, what's the impact of the cumulative events over time. So it's a series of pattern of harmful events that may be historical or ongoing, with the strong possibility of the risk factors being multiple, interrelated and coexisting over critical developmental periods. That's absolutely evidenced in this case. So once again, reminding us of the children's lived experiences. So the children's experienced care by someone who struggled to maintain the home. The household was frequently chaotic. She did not take her children to critical medical appointments or critical appointments to meet their developmental needs. She was often tearful, frequently shouted. There were episodes of domestic abuse, and a household that featured multiple visitors coming in and out, often drinking alcohol and taking drugs. And these were children
that spent, as I said before, the majority of their times in their rooms playing on the internet. So, but the gaps were really effectively filled in many, many ways by the care provided, particularly at the primary schools. So food parcels, clothes, just mentioned some of those things. Making sure children went to appointments, bringing the audiology professionals to the school to ensure those appointments were met, making sure the cochlear implants were sorted, making sure the children had glasses that were often broken, missing, and really impacting on their learning. The perpetual question that just kept coming up and coming up through the review and also actually through the case itself. When do we stop doing more of the same? When is a higher threshold of intervention needed? When do we step this into statutory care, for example? That question remains unanswered, really, for at least 10 years, despite the evidence that was held across the multi-agency network. And it remains unanswered as a question unless we can truly get to the heart of a child's world and truly understand their unique needs and their unique life experience in the context of this family. So, we know from the research, it's all out there, it's been out there for a very long time. It's, teenage years, we'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a bit, mental health difficulties, vulnerability to criminal sexual exploitation, poor academic achievement, substance misuse, missing, high risk-taking behaviour. For younger children, we know compromises brain development, but it compromises their emotional attachments, their emotional relationships, their relationships with peers, their sense of self, their sense of belonging, their sense of value in this world. And we know for babies, very sadly, as in this case, it can be fatal. So this is research links to this research. It's NSECC, Troubled Teens. Research in practice, really good, you've probably seen it, The Difficult Age in Children's Society. So you see the sort of dates of these. I mean, people have said to me in using some of the research, it's a bit old, but it remains the same. We've known about this for some time. It's knowing how to respond, which is the issue. So in the absence of an evidence-based assessment tool, the response was to reset and start again. So absolutely, the acute episodes were dealt with. They were dealt with by multi-agency services, responded to quickly in a timely way. Assessments took place, they were timely. Multi-agencies, meetings took place, child protection conferences took place, plans were set up, they were timely. And then as the acute episode passed, so services withdrew. Particular children's services, and obviously schools can't withdraw. So they're the ones holding the composite memory of this family. As I say, there was a service narrative, particularly within children's services, and this is quite common in Norfolk, in that they can work with families that are known and known well across the generations. So this was a family born, brought up, lived in Norfolk, in the same area of Norfolk, across the generations. It was a family that was known and known well, where the parenting was not quite good enough, but not quite bad enough to do something different. So assessments were then frozen in time by responding to acute concern and then withdrawing. The impact on the individual child was out of view, as again, it's starting again and again and again. It's just, again, that revolving cycle. The members of the Rapid Review questioned whether this was an issue of Stockholm Syndrome, where you develop a psychological empathy or bond with those that have captured you, basically, and where this term comes from. And they wondered whether that applied to practitioners' views of mother. And it was something I asked practitioners, and I often ask this question of practitioners when I'm speaking with them and having a dialogue with them. Did you like the person? And people said, well, what's the relevance of that? Well, it is relevant, because we can feel, why do we like this person? We need to question that. What is it that's drawing me to this person? Why am I feeling so empathetic? Why is the child coming out of view? Why aren't I seeing the child in this? What is it about mother that really draws on my heartstrings, really? And this was she was a likeable mother. And I spoke to her on the telephone, and I go on to engagement a bit later on a number of occasions, and I thought, oh, you sound really personable. I like you. Hello, darling, you all right? Yeah, I'll meet you then. Yes to everything. She was seen as a single parent doing her very best in really difficult circumstances. And that was absolutely compounded. I understand this, but it was compounded by the death of her baby when she was in immense grief. She loved her children. She was in immense grief about the death of her baby. And things sort of, that empathy continued and strengthened actually. But as some of the practitioners said to me, particularly the schools, things have not changed over 15 years. This isn't different. Yes, we empathise. Yes, she's in grief, but we need to focus on the children now. So, yeah, it's always really important, and I do it when I'm meeting with parents and families as part of child safeguarding practice reviews. I think, check myself. Well, I really like this person. What is it? What's drawing me to this person? Because we can then be sort of mindful of some of our possible blind spots, actually. So yeah, going on to mum. So really important to sort of gain the perspective of family members during the course of child safeguarding practice reviews. And just sort of I was curious about these multiple services, practitioners, multiple tasks, but nothing really changed. What were the consequences? What did mum see as the consequences of not doing what she was asked to do? Say yes, but just not doing it. And yeah, I made several attempts to engage with mum. And she'd say yes. And I'd travel from North London to Norfolk, to the coast of Norfolk, on a number of occasions, where she said, yeah, I want to meet you then, come to the house. Are you sure you want to go to the house? We can go somewhere different. No, come to the house. Knock on the door, she's not there. Phone her up. Oh, I'm shopping. I'm really sorry. Okay, shall I come back later? Yes, you can come at lunchtime. Go back, knock on the door, curtains closed, no one at home, no response to the phone call I made. And then say, oh, okay, so managed to get in contact again, doing it all over again. And the issue that came up, and we'll go on to this, was this disguised compliance, that was the word that was used, was it just simple non-engagement? She said yes when she meant no, in terms of the things that were asked of her as a parent. Yeah, I mean, life, despite the multiple services and the hundreds of practitioners involved, life carried on as before. For mum. There were no real consequences to her in terms of the involvement of practitioners. And so without using that evidence-based assessments tool, things just drifted for years. The other issue, of course, is that it's simply overwhelming. It's simply overwhelming for families to have multiple tasks set, and not know what the priorities are, and not know what the outcome could be of not doing something, of saying yes when you mean no. And an evidence-based tool can help in that. It really provides some form of honesty and transparency with families. These are some of the other key lines of inquiry, the questions posed by the partnership at the start of the review. So, was there sufficient understanding of the dynamics in the family and the role of fathers in children's lives? How well were the fathers engaged, and how well were they supported in supporting this family? So we know that the full picture of family life and children's experiences was not held in view, but there was an exception to that in terms of the primary school, which on occasions they posed the valid challenge. Are we going to do more of the same? When is the higher threshold reached? And it's a valid systems dilemma. We all know this, that we know from the research, particularly recently coming out from the Nuffield Foundation, is that the outcomes for children, for a number of children in state care are often poor. So it's that dilemma, do they remain in this family, particularly reaching adolescence, when it's in some ways, and we'll go on to this a little bit too late, or do we remove them into state care? The review suggests we need to move from a binary position of remain at home, state care, and consider flexible and alternative solutions. In this, we're talking about 5 fathers who are actively involved. They knew their children would visit them, and 6 extended families. But those families weren't contacted. The fathers were unseen as part of the multi-agency intervention. So we were challenged. I was challenged by using the term, well, this is a single parent. Challenged by a panel member saying it wasn't a single parent. We have these active fathers. They're there. They're just not seen. How do we support them? We'll go on to step up and be the dads they want to be. And that's a quote from one of the fathers. Help me to be the best dad I can be. I just don't know how to do this. He was a father for the first time. And he was asking me those questions as part of this review when I met with him. This is taken from the Myth of Invisible Men. As you know, the national panel completed a review. It was published last year, was it? Called The Myth of Invisible Men. The LSTCC challenges us on that. They say men aren't invisible and they're not hidden, because we're talking hidden fathers. They're not hiding somewhere in a broom cupboard. They're not invisible. They are there. It's a matter of seeing them. There's just a quote from The Myth of Invisible Man about sort of deeply ingrained roles, stereotypes that still are held in this society about parenthood. Mothers continue to be regarded as the prime and sometimes only protective carer for their children. And the report sets out systemic weaknesses in the way in which we engage fathers. Too often we allow fathers not to be seen. So these are some of the other key lines of inquiry, questions posed by the partnership, firstly around domestic abuse and impact and the risk of physical harm. So as I've said before, there were episodes of domestic abuse, they were sporadic. Encountered 3 that were reported to the police and effectively responded to in the lifetime of the children. And the services were provided, policies were followed, strategy meetings took place, the children were subject to child protection plans. When no other incident of domestic abuse arose, so the children came off the plan, and children's services withdrew. But over the years, what it was apparent to me was this a chaotic and volatile household. That was the children's daily lived experiences. Arguments and shouting constantly within the home. Physical chastisement was another accepted norm. This is a mother who used physical chastisement, I hate that term, but anyway, physical chastisement in order to discipline her children. I mean, I question that the incidents disclosed by the girls earlier on was not physical chastisement, it was physical harm. And it's really getting to beneath how we understand and interpret physical harm sometimes, in fact, as physical chastisement. What does it mean to a child to experience that? And I think it's particularly relevant because this was the eldest child reporting this to the police, wanting something different to happen. And the research is clear, it has a long-term impact on children. We need to stop normalising this. So, further questions about substance misuse. Mother was really open about using drugs. Teachers spoke to us about her referring to Cocaine Tuesday, and that was the Tuesday when the cocaine was bought, for whatever reason, and taken. And that was just regular. They also spoke about suppliers coming to the house, wanting money, because she was in debt, drug debt, and how the children were taught and learnt how to hide, keep quiet, keep all the curtains drawn. It was sort of interpreted as mother self-medicating. And there's kind of a sympathy for that. Self-medication on drugs is commonly used, and it's particularly used in relation to when she was dealing with the terrible grief of the loss of her baby. But
that was not helpful in terms of understanding the child's lived experience of a volatile mother who was unpredictable, who was unable or inconsistently met their needs. And I've spoken to practitioners and read records in relation to adolescents who live with substance misusing parents. And they spoke, and you can see them speaking to trusted adults, about what that felt like in adolescence. Sadly, both of these young people died, one tragic accident, and one from taking their own lives. But what they spoke about was raging arguments would happen in the evening because their parents had been drinking too much alcohol. And their parents simply could not remember those arguments in the morning. You know, for children, what does that feel like as an adolescent to deal with that on a daily basis? There's no closure to that. That argument, what was said, what wasn't said. And young people who speak about parents being embarrassing, actually, when their friends come round. 1 minute being really loving and endearing, gushing. The next minute being rageful. That's the result. That's what happens. Unintentionally, but it happens. The often unintentional consequence of particularly alcohol, but also substance misuse. So again, a constellation of cumulative risks that included drug and alcohol misuse, which became an accepted norm. So these are some of the conclusions that I reached in this review. Pressure on resources, the volume you face, of the demands you face, can lead to multi-agency services addressing each risk as it emerges, the blue light service that we are all familiar with. Research suggests that children are harmed by cumulative harm. It's a cumulative event. It's not those individual incidents, and which can include living in families where there's substance misuse. So the sheer complexity of assessing and responding to neglect in a system that's set up and proficient in safeguarding a child from immediate harm means that providing a response to children who are facing the constellation of harm, the harm posed by low-level chronic neglect, can risk being delayed. So our responses can risk being delayed. It can wait. So a third area was felt really important was paying attention to the language we use, and I think, Isabel, you referred to that earlier. And these are the sort of terms I heard practitioners talk about. I saw it in multi-agency records. So this is a case of disguised compliance, I think was said by every practitioner. Just really trying to get beneath that. What did that mean? Well, there's no shared understanding of what that meant, in fact. And when sort of unpicking that, was this disguised compliance? Was she going to things and saying she was going to complete these things? Was she attending a parenting course? Was she spending British Sign Language courses, but just simply not doing it when she got home? No, she wasn't attending at all. She'd say yes and just didn't attend. Was this disguised compliance? Was that a sort of fancy way of kind of framing this? It was non-engagement. She wasn't engaging. When you looked at the outcomes for the children, it needed to be labelled as non-engagement. She'd say yes, she meant no. She said yes, as practitioners said to me, to get you off her back. So low-level neglect referred to, physical chastisement referred to, single parent I've referred to, and it's powerful. It's really important to pay attention to the language you use in safeguarding work that we can routinely use. I understand it. We can use shortcuts. We sometimes pushed to use some terminology, some fancy terminology, but really getting underneath that becomes important, particularly in relation to the use, and you'll know this in relation to the term I see in records of from a one-off observation of a parent and child relationship when it's termed as a good attachment. That's particularly relating to young children who's actually needs to survive, and that's the only carer they have. So really getting and describing what they're saying. Don't take a shortcut. Correlates with findings from national reviews, and I've noticed that the NSVCC have started quite an interesting blog around the language we use. It's really sort of short, bite-sized extracts where they talk about the language we use in safeguarding work, really asking us to reflect and challenge on that. So I'm going to speed up. These are the conclusions. It's a testament to the incredible work you all complete in many, many ways every single day when you're safeguarding children, but these practitioners were not supported sufficiently in order to use an evidence-based tool in order to assess the risk and respond in time for the child. So opportunities were lost and it reached a binary position. Just to say the conclusion was that what happened with this case was that a joint, in Norfolk they do these as a result of some child safeguarding practice reviews I'd completed in the past, where it promoted the use of a multi-agency reflective forum. And it was a time when, we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we said we can't have professional meetings, families need to be involved at all times. And I kind of posed the challenge, which is you're expecting multi-agencies to work together to safeguard children. How can you not have multi-agency supervision or a reflective forum that brings the multi-agency group together? So that's what they started. They started joint area group supervision. They're very active now in Norfolk in the current day. So a JAGS was held. Senior managers became very exercised about this case as a result of attending the workshop, and actually it led to the 2 younger children being removed. So Jake's doing really well in foster care, flourishing, blooming, described as a completely different child. So in foster care, doing well. The younger child is with paternal grandmother, doing well. The 2 eldest children struggled to find a placement for these children. You'll know that, those who work in children's services, really struggling to find a placement for teenage children who are starting on the cusp of high-risk behaviours. So they were trying to find alternative options with family and kinship. It was too late for those 2 children. Okay, so I just want to touch on a parallel child safeguarding practice review that was taking place in Norfolk at the same time. So this was a 17-year-old child who'd experienced long-term anxiety, long-term involvement of child and adolescent mental health services, a mother who had mental health difficulties, depressed over the lifetime of this child. Her needs dominated for this child and for the siblings in this family. She died unexpectedly. There was immense grief felt by child A.L. He was looked after then by father who had mental health difficulties and abused alcohol. There was neglect then continuing into his later adolescence, and very sadly, he took his own life. So the long-term lifespan of neglect stretches across the years. So moving on to sort of the ripples, these are some of the shared findings. I've sort of touched on those already. We've done that, I'm going to move on. We know the research, as I said, it's been around a really long time. This is from the NSCCC. It's about babies, the impact on babies, on their brain development, on their emotional attachment, on their future relationships. And children more likely to have depression, ADHD, PTSD, memory impairments, panic disorder. And for young people, more likely to have risk-taking behaviour, higher risk-taking behaviour than their peers. More likely to be running away from home, to go missing, to break the law, to abuse drugs and alcohol, and to be involved in unhealthy relationships. So I just want to touch on this review. I think it's really important when thinking about ripples, lifetime, what's the impact? Can it wait? Is the key question. So I led this review in Croydon, published in 2019, and it took a really long time to complete actually, because it involved 60 children. So agencies were asked to identify their top list of children they were most worried about. And the names of these 60 children came up, boys and girls. So we started to look into their history. what was going on for them. What was going on for them at the time: serious youth violence, association with gangs, county lines, high-risk behaviour in terms of self-harm, perpetrators and victims of assault and serious youth violence, perpetrators and the victims of sexual abuse and exploitation, poor school attendance, managed moves excluded in pupil referral units and frequently missing, poor mental health and well-being. No surprises there. So what the data told us was that 15% were known to children's services, either for child protection, child in need plans, neglect, quite a lot of early experiences of living in a household with domestic abuse. So 16 from the age of 1, 31 by the age of 5, 11 by the age of 11, 44, and from 12 onwards we have 16. And I think this is an interesting graph in that it shows you trajectory, what happens when they first coming into care, and we have that peak in adolescence. There's a peak when they're really at high risk. They're starting to think they're associated with gangs. They're starting to be known to the Youth Justice Service. They're starting to be show the difficulties in their mental health and well-being, excluded from school, out of the old term, out of control of parents. Parents don't know what to do. But we know that the origins lie in the past. So just an example, 70% were known to CAMS. The youngest was 4, the oldest was 17, and there was a steady stream of referrals. So here you just have a picture of what the different diagnoses that were given for the boys and the girls. The highest rate of referrals into CAMS were 9 and 12. So 12 is an interesting age, isn't it? Entering into adolescence, the brain starts changing. You're starting to look outside the family. Just a picture of, the research on adverse childhood experiences. That's the trajectory. And here we have, sort of further down, adopt health, harming behaviours and crime. That was the cohort. That's where they were in their lifetime. So just touching a little bit on, and this is it's not well researched. We don't know for sure the origins of self-neglect, but I think it's worth us reflecting about those origins. How far does neglect in childhood contribute to neglect, self-neglect in adulthood? Why? Because they don't know how to value themselves, they don't know how to look, they've not been taught, they haven't been modelled how to identify their needs and have their needs met. And ultimately, that can cause self-neglect. But I say, it's not a very well-researched area. I think it's a shame that we don't do child safeguarding practice reviews that cross across a lifespan. Because we often do children, and then we might do a SAR, safeguarding adults review, when they're into adulthood. I'd like us to cross across the lifespan when looking at this particular issue. A really sad case is safeguarding adult review. I was supervising another area, now published. It's a young person with a history of emotional harm, of neglect, coming into local authority care at the age of 15. I think one of the things that really struck me about him was that he really wanted a sense of identity and belonging. Where do I belong? Where can I get human connection with others? He got it with the street homeless. Unfortunately, in those circumstances, he was often manipulated, physically harmed, and on occasions used as a guinea pig to try drugs. And he wanted to take drugs to take him out of what he was feeling on a day-to-day basis. And when the police found him dead due to drug overdose in his accommodation, the pictures I saw were extreme neglect of his accommodation. He was living independently. So I'm going to finish with the words of a child. And I feel emotional every time I think of him. So this was a young man who was part of the 60. He was at high risk, gang associated, perpetrator of violence, victim of serious youth violence, in and out of youth offending institutes, using drugs, alcohol, constantly missing. and enjoyed joyriding mopeds, stealing a moped, joyriding with his mates. Took a moped out once with his mates, 3 of them on this moped, and involved in a fatal collision where he died. And when I really looked into the detail of the agency records, I saw that in the last month of his life, there had been a really lovely, trusted relationship formed with a youth justice worker. And he said to her, "Where were you when I was 6? What he's talking about is early intervention. Get it right early. And what I saw in the records was this was a child, absolutely, who had been neglected, not held in mind, because unintentionally for his mother, mental health difficulties, substance and alcohol misuse." So just a reminder to us of the wonderful work you do, of how trusted relationships with these children, even over time when they're 17, that they can find a time to say, "Where were you when I was 6? It means, where was somebody like you in my life? I trust you, I can talk to you." Showed a level of insight that he was able to have about his life. But the critical importance of identifying neglect early and responding. Children want us to do that. Thank you.